Hello everyone, I'm Debbie Hilliard, Director of Education. It's a pleasure to speak to you from the exhibition Eduardo Chillida here in Hauser Wirth, Somerset, which is now open and runs until the 3rd of January 2022. Please visit our website to make a booking to come and visit. To mark the occasion, you're joining our live digital event, Out in the Open, Public Art from Chillida to Nevelson. Public art was of huge importance to Eduardo Chillida, and during his lifetime he installed over 40 public works worldwide. This event is the outcome of conversations between Niall Hobhouse of Drawing Matter and Ellis Woodman of the Architecture Foundation, and we're delighted to be joined by 3 guests who will discuss the topic of public sculpture between the 1950s and 1970s. Adrian is Professor Emeritus of Architectural History at the Bartlett School of Architecture and Honorary Curator of Architecture at the Royal Academy. Nicholas Olsberg, former Director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture and founding Head of the Getty's Special Collections, is an archivist, curator, writer and historian. And Nausica Sanchez, researcher and educator at Chillida Leku, a museum dedicated to the life and work of Eduardo Chillida. Finally, our guests will be looked after by Niall Hobhouse. Niall collects drawings by architects. He established the Drawing Matter Trust to explore the role of drawing in architecture, architectural education and exhibitions. This event is closed captioned. If you'd like to use this facility, please click the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen. We should also love to take your questions, so if you have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, type your question in, and we'll endeavour to address them all. Welcome, Neil. Thank you for bringing together our brilliant guests for this evening. Over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm actually talking to you, for those who don't know, just 3 miles away from the really fascinating Chillida show at Durslade, which I would encourage you all to go and see. Welcome to everybody this evening, and particularly to our speakers, 3 very thoughtful scholars whom I admire, and each talking about works of arts and public projects that they understand very, very well. I should say just quickly that the excitement for me personally is that we're in a period after the war until the end of the 70s, because it interests me particularly because there's it encompasses a much more open conception of public space, more generous, more democratic than we perhaps understand today. And I'm very interested in the lessons that we can draw from what they tell us. The other point, much more selfish, is that I've always recognized this era of 30 years as one of those moments when architects and artists are working much more closely together and without tension and competition. And this, I've always felt, is to everybody's benefit. I'm going to hand over immediately now to Adrian Forty, who will begin the discussion. My suggestion is that we take questions at the end, and look forward to receiving them from you as we go along. Adrian.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil. Okay. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a short-lived fashion for large-scale concrete sculptural reliefs attached to buildings that were, more often than not, also made of concrete. And this is one of the more ambitious ones by the Sardinian-born but American-domiciled artist Costantino Nivola, who made a name for himself specializing in just these kinds of reliefs. We'll come back to Nivola a bit later on. A lot of these reliefs are pretty humdrum. So this is one outside a supermarket in Sheffield in England. And I just want to start by saying a few things in general about these reliefs. First of all, they appear all over the place. They're everywhere. So this is one in Tbilisi in Georgia. There are lots and lots of them behind the former Iron Curtain, and particularly in East Germany. And these are some East German examples here, here, here. And then we find them in West European social democracies. So these are examples from the UK. This one's in London. These are in the University of York, these two. And then, of course, we find them in the United States, where Nivola was one of the main exponents. So this is another East German example, complete with a bit of nationalistic graffiti on it. Now, formally, there are many similarities between these reliefs in different parts of the world, but they didn't necessarily all serve quite the same purposes. Those in Eastern European and Soviet-controlled countries have to be seen in terms of the state control of art, where art was not about individual self-expression, but instead had to represent a shared collective identity. An important part of this was the relocation of art from its traditional bourgeois domain, that is the gallery or the private home, to a collective space that notionally at least belonged to everybody. This is a detail of the one that we've been just looking at. The outward facing walls of buildings fitted this purpose very well. In Western European social democracies, the emphasis was rather different, especially in the period of post-war reconstruction. So this is a British example, when for the first time, most building was being undertaken by the state or by state agencies. And the issue here was to give, in the much used phrase of the time, the common man, a sense of identity with and of shared ownership in these new buildings. There was a strong humanist impulse to this, and the earlier murals particularly often focused upon historical events, or as you can see here, local features, as a way of reconciling the newness of the buildings with their occupants' own personal pasts. In the United States, on the other hand, more of the commissions came from the private or corporate sector. This one's a automobile showroom in New York. And the works often had to do with improving the signifying possibilities of architecture, to make it speak more loudly or more coherently, a tendency that was parodied by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in their 1972 Learning from Las Vegas, as you see here. So although all these reliefs in different parts of the world on the face of it appear rather similar, both in their iconography and in their technique, their intentions were, I think, rather different, and we can't assume that they're all entirely interchangeable. In formal terms, the reliefs range between the figurative, this is an East German one here, the scientist in his lab, between the figurative and the abstract. So this is another East German example here. Many of them are one-offs that were designed for specific buildings and locations. but some of them, like this one, are essentially patterns made up out of small components that could be repeated and reproduced endlessly. In East Germany, a surprisingly large number of the reliefs are of this type, of this abstract patterning. And partly, I think this was because it was one of the few ways to escape the monotony of the ubiquitous industrial panel systems. But also, this was an opportunity to experiment with abstraction that was not officially sanctioned as art in the Eastern Bloc, yet was nonetheless acceptable when it took the form of decoration. Technically, in terms of manufacture, most of the reliefs are prefabricated. They're made up in precast sections like these ones here that were made elsewhere and then brought to the site and fixed to the building. But sometimes they were cast in place as part of the building. Like this is a pub in Sheffield, sorry, in Coventry, or like this is the government building in Oslo, where you've got a relief that was done by the artist Carl Nesjar, who basically etched Picasso drawings onto the surface of the building by sandblasting away the surface finish to leave this kind of drawn effect. And you've got another one here. This is in Barcelona. This is Nesjar again. And in these cases, you know, the relief is really integral to the building. You couldn't remove the relief. You destroy it if you did so. It's part and parcel of the building. What were the motives for this short-lived fashion? Well, I've mentioned some of them, but in strictly architectural terms, they can be seen as a response to the long-standing expectation that in modernist architecture, walls would come to disappear. And against the tendency in a lot of modernist architecture to dematerialize walls, these reliefs represented an attempt to restore depth and thickness to the wall so that it might again become an expressive surface. The reliefs were often compared to the walls of ancient Egyptian temples, whose surfaces were rich with images and hieroglyphs representing mythological and historical events. And the relocation of the Abu Simbel temples, which was necessitated by the flooding caused by the building of the Aswan Dam, was very much in the news at this time and provided a kind of topical background for a lot of these relief works. Okay, so back to Nivola. Here we are. This is Nivola with one of his sand casts. Let me say there's an exhibition of Nivola on at the moment in Cold Spring outside New York. And if you look at the website, you can have a walk round of the exhibition. It's of these sand casts. And there's also a very nice short film on the gallery website if you want to know more about him and his work. Now, in the context of these concrete reliefs, Nivola really stands out from the other people making them in that he and his work was much more actively connected to the artistic avant-garde than anyone else's, except perhaps from the Norwegian Carl Nesjar, who did those reliefs of Picasso's. So he's one of the few people really who actually one can see as being a serious, recognized artist who connects with the avant-garde. Very briefly, Nivola was born in Sardinia, and he kept links with the island throughout his life. There's a museum of his work in his hometown of Orani. He studied art in Italy, became a muralist, and then he became the artistic director of Olivetti in the late 1930s. But in 1939, because his wife was Jewish, he left and went to America, where he settled permanently. He seems to have been a super sociable, fun guy, and he made lots of friends in the New York art and architectural scene, among them the artists Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, Saul Steinberg, and the architects José Luis Serre and Bernard Rudofsky. And he hit it off with Le Corbusier. This is Le Corbusier on the beach, who's Le Corbusier stayed with Nivola when he was working on the United Nations building. In 1948, Nivola bought a house on Long Island with 35 acres of land, which became a kind of large experimental outdoor studio. And he started making reliefs while messing around on the beach, making shapes in the sand into which he would pour plaster. And this is exactly what he was doing with Le Corbusier here. From these, this kind of scale of work, these sort of Picasso-like sand casts, he went on to make much larger scale reliefs in concrete that would come to be fixed to buildings. These were made up in sections, cast flat on a bed of stand with steel reinforcement placed in them. And here he is setting up the making of one of these reliefs, which you'll see in a moment. It's basically a very simple process. They were cast flat, steel was added to them, they were boxed up and then transported and fixed to the building. Even with the largest reliefs, Nivola did most of the work himself. That's him there, helped by just his family, the odd friend, and a couple of laborers here. That's the crew. With most of his architectural commissions, Nivola seems to have been sort of succeeded in being in at the beginning, so that the design of his reliefs was part of the conception of the building. This was fairly unusual, since most of the reliefs that we've seen were supplements to already designed buildings. Nivola's success in fitting the building to the relief rather than the relief to the building seems to have come about partly because he chose generally to work with architects who weren't especially grand or big names. I mean, there are two exceptions to this. He worked with BBPR, the Italian practice, and with Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-born American architect. But even then, he seems to have been able to make sure that his work was conceived as part of the original scheme. Nivola's control over the commissions and the scale at which he was able to work are two of the things that really set his work apart from others being produced at the time. This is the installation of the piece that we saw being cast on the ground earlier, Nivola made a lot of the fact that his sculptures were made with exactly the same materials, that is sand and cement, as the buildings that they were part of, and with much the same techniques, precasting, giving them a consistency with the building as a whole. In this way, he saw himself as normalizing sculpture, doing away with the barrier between sculpture and architecture, and restoring a continuity between artist, architect, and builder that had been lost since the Middle Ages. The panels of the reliefs could be lifted and fixed with exactly the same equipment as standard precast panels. So in the eyes of construction teams, they became just a normal part of the process of building. There was nothing special about them. They weren't arty. This is the finished work that we were looking at just now. This was the one that was being cast and that he was standing against. This is an insurance building in Hartford, Connecticut. And then this is another of his buildings. This is a newspaper building in Bridgeport. Now, just to step back and look at these concrete reliefs more generally, I think it should be fair to say that both in the Eastern Bloc countries and in the West, their reception was pretty mixed. They weren't universally loved. Some architects were enamored of them, but plenty weren't, and saw the reliefs as compromising or diminishing the architecture rather than adding to it. The attitude that good architecture shouldn't need artistic embellishment was a strongly held belief in the modernist tradition going back to arts and crafts days. In East Germany, there was criticism of what was described as the artification, Bekunstung of architecture, and of what was seen as the poor taste of officialdom in the choice of much of the iconography. Even Nivola came in for criticism. The American critic Lewis Mumford, while he appreciated Nivola's reliefs as art, objected to their incorporation into works of architecture, to which he believed they added nothing. Concrete reliefs went out of fashion almost as quickly as they had come into fashion. By the early 1970s, they'd virtually gone. And this, I think, was partly the result of the sudden fall from grace of concrete as a construction material that took place around 1970. And it was partly to do with the rise of postmodernism, which developed other ways of making architecture signify, making this kind of artistic supplement superfluous. They survive today as relics of a historical moment.
Thank you, Adrian, for that wonderful European tour at the beginning. It actually was a reminder to me that we're not talking simply about a social democratic phenomenon. But it also actually is the perfect prelude to what Nicholas is going to talk about, just in terms of the historic moment that he will present to us. So I think I'm not going to intervene in any further way and just hand straight over to him now.
Hello. We're in 1971 on a day of crystal clear skies. and 1972 on the right, on a similar day. What we are looking at is the World Trade Center nearing completion, 10 years after its initial conception, and then beginning to be finalized with its works of art, Koenig and James Rosati in the plaza on the right. It's exactly 10 years, as I said, since the conception developed of this monument and functioning center for international trade and cultural exchange and all of the things that went with the sense of peaceful coexistence, understanding between peoples, and the movement for open borders and open trade that marked the first Kennedy years and ended up with 1 month before the designs were developed, the first great congressional act opening up American borders essentially to trade without tariffs. The start of a globalization process, which we are the beneficiaries and the sufferers now. So it's a heady moment of possible peacefulness, of possible prosperity, endlessly developed on an international basis. It's the ends, the winds of change have blown, and the sense of a worldwide community of peoples is developing, and the World Trade Center stands for that as much as it stands for aggressive American capitalism, which of course was driving the process as well. The architect appointed, Minoru Yamasaki, in the summer of 1962, started to develop these designs, and then hired Carlos Diniz, illustrator who described himself as an illusionist and as a propagandist of the visual, to develop drawings and panels that would explain, advocate, celebrate what was being done in the face of very considerable opposition. There were two approaches to this. If we have the next slide, you'll see. One of them was to stress the fact that these towers, 110 stories high, were not going to intrude upon the landscape, but to ornament it and to give it a transcendental quality. I don't know that Yamasaki thought of them as transcendental, but I know that Diniz from the drawings is clearly seeing them as light-catching objects in the landscape rather than things that block your view or cast shadows into the street. The other option was to look at the open space beneath it. If we look at the next slide, which is an alternative cover for the same brochure program presenting the project in January 1964, where what we're invited to look at is a very, very active, dynamic, almost relentlessly mobile urban space, a sense of urbanity that is just beginning to intrude into the notion of plaza. We've had a spate of windy, windswept, vacant, empty plazas throughout North America emerging, and suddenly we're looking at something more celebratory, presented in that fashion because there was a huge resistance to this great vacant spot in the middle of the downtown landscape becoming a dead space. So much effort devoted to showing it as an active space. We'll see how that changes as we look later at this whole propagandistic program of drawing. As it moved along, there were certain clear changes in direction. The plaza tended to drift toward that empty vacancy, that eerie open space that had marked so many other places, from the C1 Plaza, forgive me for saying so, even onwards. And if we see the next slides, you'll see the models as they're developing are beginning to sense the fact that we might need a work of art somewhere within the space. This is not memorial art and not commemorative art, but abstract art of a metaphysical nature that is to be placed at some point of focus. You see on the left, the 1964 proposal, where it is near the entrance, and on the right, something getting close to what finally happens, which is something to offset the big bad buildings, in Ada Louise Huxtable's wonderful statement, who's afraid of the big bad buildings, and then Billy, she says, a new sky parade or the biggest tombstones in the world. Rather eerie, but a sense that there was something forbidding about these buildings, and there was something needed to raise the spiritual temper of what was beneath them. In fact, the commissions for works of art went to something not quite like what you're seeing in the picture, but the first and major commission was to Fritz Koenig. We see him, and this was something called a sphere Caryatid that was to stand above the fountain in a focal circle square. You're talking about a vast plaza. It is bigger than the Piazza San Marco and the Plaza Mayor. It is nearly twice the size of Trafalgar Square, and it's bounded by this remarkable, at the beginning of the design, with hints maintained, Moorish conception of how a modern building might be developed. What Yamasaki was doing was, and he had done before, was to return to the Moorish and the Persian and other Middle Eastern precedents as well, to look for a language for scientific and progressive scientific architectural works. Very, very odd, but not historically inappropriate, that indeed the best science of many centuries was developed in Andalusia and in Tunisia. And he was very much aware of this and developed much of his things, as we shall see, along those lines. He also thought, and it's where this comes in, that the Kaaba in Mecca was a good model, and the whole of that use of the plaza surrounded by galleries or pavilions, continuous pavilions or arcades, whatever may you wish to call them, was an appropriate model to follow. So this was the modern Kaaba going in the middle of the square. The second work, if we see the Nagari, was Mazuyuki Nagari's Cloud Fortress in black granite, drawing down the sky into a reflective surface. It's both of the earth and reflecting the sky above it, which is, it's actually rather a wonderful piece. And it stood hovering above the steps of the entrance, as if between the earth and the sky, in a rather compelling way. Nagari and Koenig were both children of the war. Koenig, a prisoner of war in the East after combat on the Eastern Front at the age of 18. At the similar age, 18, in 1945, Nagari volunteered to be a suicide pilot in the Japanese army to attack American buildings with his plane. That was 3 days before the war ended, and he didn't get to do so. It was a moment he eerily remembered 30 years after our first image on that clear blue day when the towers came down. Other works of art appeared relatively quickly. If we can see them, we've got James Rosati on the left, Alexander Korda in the middle, the one that became the most popular, and it moved around as the use of the square plaza changed. You have the Miro, these sort of weeping figures in a gigantic 35-foot mural in one lobby, and in another 35-foot piece, Louise Nevelson's 35 pieces of a reflection on the sky at night as it casts itself into the city. I've never seen quite how that is reflected, but this is that was her argument for it. We have the next slide, please. All but one were lost. And this, in its battered and bruised state and a little bit polished up, now stands, I think rather inappropriately, as a memorial to resilience a few hundred feet away on a sky terrace called Liberty Park, which is an exercise in banality that is very disturbing in many ways. I think these weren't the monuments New York was looking for, that the works of art New York wanted needed something else. As Koenig started to work on this piece, we find Yamasaki constantly asking him for bigger and bigger and bigger. The point was, ultimately, it couldn't be big enough, not just against these towers, but against the scale of Manhattan. If we see the next slide, you see the point, I think, really is that the great need in Manhattan was for a sense of a monument that was as big as the city itself. This was a sliver of jumbled disorder, enchanting to some and disturbing to others, on an island between two stretches of water. And Buckminster Fuller in 1960 and Adolfo Natalini in Superstudio in 1969, dreaming of something that brought the sky down as a monument in its own right. And if we see the next one, we'll see that in fact, the monument became the great artwork, despite its architectural weaknesses, became the Twin Towers. Those of us who were old enough to despise it did so. But for a younger generation, it stood in the city as a sort of beacon of simplicity and minimalism in the landscape of disorder and delirium. And here you see Madeleine Wissendorp and Rem Koolhaas in the second version of their vision of the World Trade Center in the distance and a monument they are delivering to New York as a swimming pool coming towards it. The two are very similar in shape and style. So in some ways, if we see the next slides, these are sketches for this propaganda. We're starting to see that it's the ineffable space between these two towers, that it's their ubiquitousness, it's their unexpectedness in the landscape, it's their sense as a monument of simplicity in this delirious space. And that was the work of art, the public work of art, that had most meaning, and its meaning grew. Shall we start the rest?
Thank you, Nicholas. That was wonderful. It, of course, completely confounds my opening premise that this was an era in which architects and artists worked in happy and close collaboration. But it's actually a perfect introduction to what the project that Nausica is going to tell us about, which came at the end of the 70s and in a very different political climate in which, I mean, 4 years after Franco's death, but which is, I think, an unreservedly happy story. And I'm going to pass on to Nausica immediately.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you, Debbie, for your kind invitation and for all your efforts. And yes, it has a happy end, this project, The Combo of the Wind. I will talk about The Combo of the Wind, and it has a very, very happy end. And well, the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote these words for the catalogue of Eduardo Chillida's first exhibition at Galerie Maet in Paris in 1956. Eduardo Chillida wants the iron to reveal aerial realities to us. In the city of the Basque Coast where he lives, he's going to build on a rock an iron antenna in front of the sea, which must vibrate with all the movements of the wind. He will call this iron tree, which he will grow on the rock, the comb of the wind. The rock alone in its lonely peak will respond en masse to the fantasies of the storm. The iron multiplied in its branches by the dreaming hammer will give all its breath to the hair of the wind. So Chillida was dreaming of combing the wind since he was very young. This dream finally will become true with the installation of the Comb of the Wind in 1977. And the Comb of the Wind is certainly one of the most important work of the Basque sculptor Eduardo Chillida. It is a great monumental complex composed by 3 colossal sculptures made on steel, as you can see. The sculptures are situated in front of the sea in a place which is the beginning and the end of the city. The starting point is a place where we can feel a direct relation with the landscape, with the environment, with the city, and with the natural elements. And it's certainly the most relevant public project of Eduardo Chillida. And during the process, the artists really wanted to integrate urbanists, architects, sculptors, poets, and writers to think about the place and to reflect on what a city must be. And it had to be a way to think about philosophy regarding the city. And the Comb of the Wind was born as a homage to his people, to the Basque people, and to his hometown, San Sebastian. And in this particular place, which is the beginning and the end of the city, as I have mentioned, Chillida saw his dream became true, to let the wind enter in the city and comb the wind. So in fact, with this poetical title, the artist inverted the eternal metaphor. So normally it is the wind that comes, and here it's the wind is combed as it enters in the city. So this monumental work gathers the most important concepts in the artwork of Chillida: the presence of nature, the scale, the gravity, the public works, the limit, and the creation of places and the human values. And the first subject is the direct relation with nature and with the natural elements, as we can see in this amazing picture. So the work is situated in dialogue with the sea and in dialogue with the strength of the wind, with the rocks, with the mountain, with the waves and the movement of tides. And it's a place for encounter with nature. Another important element for Chillida was the scale. And the scale is a very significant concept for Chillida because the scale and the dimension of the work must be in balance with the environment and with the size of the place and with what is around. So the size really depends on the situation and the dimension of the place. And the scale of Chillida is always, and that is very important, is a human scale. So we, or the spectators, are the center of his work. So it must be in communication with the visitor. So it's always a human scale. And another concept that belongs to Chillida is gravity. So gravity is another important theme in his artwork. So the sculptor is always trying to fight the gravity. His sculpture seems to be always floating in the space in a constant fight with Newton and with Newton's law. And Chillida uses the weight to rebel against the weight. Particularly for this work, he was influenced by the movement of the water and its activity in the planet. So the water goes up, it evaporates, and then it falls again in a vertical line. And on the other hand, the water is the queen of horizontality. So the water and the sea have been his masters. And what is important in Chillida, in this work, but in other works also, so it's that it's a public work. And in a public work, all of us, the visitors, are the owners of the work. So the public work belongs to anyone. And for him, this idea was amazing. So, and when he dreamt about it, he wanted really to recuperate the city for the people, not a city for a commercial purpose, but he wanted to create a place where we can have a walk and where we can stay near the sea. So Chillida really created a space. So he was a creator of places, a creator of space, of places. So Chillida will put limits to a place. His sculptures really delimit, and the concept of limit, it's very important in his work. He delimits a space for encounter, a place where we can meet, And Chillida called himself architect of the void. So, and the void or the emptiness in his work is not nothing. There is always something inside. There is always a special energy that vibrates. And Chillida generated a space where something can happen, a spiritual space, a place where we can communicate with the unknown. And that links with the presence of the human values in his work. So really, as I mentioned before, the Comb of the Wind is a meeting place. Chillida has created a meeting place, a space for the community, and where human values have a special presence. And in fact, human values are always present in his work. His works talk about freedom, about tolerance, peace, and dialogue. And public work has always a very, very strong connotation regarding ethic values. Now that I have talked about some concepts that inhabit his work, I would like to focus on the main protagonist of this special artwork. Because, well, the Comb of the Wind is the sculptor's dream, but it has been mainly a collaborative work. So that has involved many people in the process, many people and many, and also the place, not only the people, because the first protagonist is the place itself. Chillida knew the place since he was a child. Here we can see a young Chillida playing in the bay, in the San Sebastian Bay, and with his wife Pilar Belfunzi in the place where he will put the sculptures. And when he was young, he loved to go there and watch the movement of the sea, and particularly when the weather was bad, he used to go and see the waves and listen to the sound. It seems that the place was waiting for him since ever. He loved to go alone and sit in front of the horizon, which was for him the homeland of all men. Sometimes he thought that he could have been a seaman or a sailor. And all in all the process of Eduardo Chillida, the material is very important. And Chillida worked in forge, in genuine forge, and he worked directly with the material. And for this project, he was helped by the knowledge of the workers of the industrial forge of Patricio Echeverria in Legazpia, in the Basque Country. And they created a special steel named Reco steel, which means resistant to erosion or resistant to corrosion. It's a sort of cotton steel. And they made the three pieces there. They created the pieces that were 2 meters high and weighed about 13 tons. So it was quite complicated to do it, and because they must solve the problems like the strength of the waves. And it was very complex to make these shapes, these helical shapes. And another great protagonist, and that link with that you have mentioned before, is the architecture. So really, this work, it's a dialogue between a sculptor and an architect. And the architect was a Basque architect named Luis Peña-Ganchegui, who was a friend of Chillida. And the artist and the architect both created the place. And what is interesting is that Peña-Ganchegui conceived this place as an anteroom for Chillida's sculpture. He imagined a space similar to the Greek temples. It was like a sort of temenos, a place for contemplation. They built the square with red granite paving stones, and the space is staggered. Here in the plan, we can see that the space is staggered on various levels that give it a sense of balance, and the levels make possible to enjoy the work and the nature from different stages. And the last protagonist and very important in this project was the engineering, because it was a big challenge to install the three pieces in the rocks. And to do this, Chillida had some valuable help also. He worked with the engineer Jose Maria Losegui, And the engineer had to put the sculptures, to set the sculptures in the place and settle the problem of moving the sculptures to the places. So at the beginning, he thought about moving the sculptures by helicopter, but they were too heavy. So finally, the dilemma was resolved by building a bridge with rails to carry the pieces up to the rock. And thanks to this operation, we can enjoy the sculptures in their current locations today. As I said before, the sculptures were installed in 1977. However, Chillida's dream of making a comb of the wind was in his mind since he was young. He was dreaming with it since he was young. He used to say that he has to be the slowest sculptor in the world because it took more than 20 years to imagine what kind of sculpture it must be to adapt with the landscape. The presence of the serialization in his work is a constant. From 1952 to 1998, he did 23 sculptures named Comb of the Wind. And the sculptures emerged because of his inquiries about the voice, the emptiness, the space, and the element. He made his first Comb of the Wind in 1952. The first Comb of the Wind is now in the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. And this one is the most static of the series. With it has rigid and rational lines. Chillida created a display of geometrical planes and angles supported in 2 points, which is important because from this moment he will abandon the 2 points and he will start using 3 points of appointment. And the second sculpture incorporates movement. It has a more organic structure with a vigorous and strong shapes. While the Comb of the Wind Study 3 is a study for a larger sculpture, the Comb of the Wind Study 6, made in 1968. This work, if you go to the next slide, please. This work is nowadays at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. It is conceptually closer to another series, Envelope of Dreams. It has a very solid vertical base and a horizontal structure that opens to the wind. And it has an extraordinary sense of balance and defies the laws of gravity. And the sculpture seems practically to levitate. Between 1966 and 1968, Chillida did various sculptures in which the base plays an important role because they support the structure. The basement is closer to the idea of the rocks. And the structures look like vibrant trees with diverse branches that take different directions in the space. But finally, when the project became real and the time to create the final piece of work approached, the artists had to face the challenge of nature itself. So then the shapes mutated again, the ramifications were simplified. The place was a factor that conditions the work. So this piece is closest to the final version. The closest works are characterized by the austerity of their forms. They resemble like claws or hooks that are trying to grasp the space. And when he made the definitive work, the definitive sculptures, he realized more elemental forms because he needed to respect the scale and the dimensions of the place. And the sculptures couldn't be more important than the place itself. So finally, he said these 3 solid steel forms and powerfully anchored to the rocks. The first 2 sculptures are located on the same geological stratum. They face each other horizontally. They keep up a permanent dialogue. It is the result of the union between past and present. While the third piece raises up vertically on the horizon. It questions the unknown future. The 3 pieces form a sacred space. They link us with the cosmos and with nature. It is an inquiry to the unknown, to the horizon and the future. However, the series, the Comb of the Wind, they didn't come to an end with the installation of the 3 pieces in San Sebastian. Chillida continued to investigate the subject and produced new variation like the Comb of the Wind 17. This sculpture is set at Chillida Leku Museum, and the work establishes a dialogue with the surrounding world of nature, and it's a tribute to his wife, Pilar Belzunce. But what is the Comb of the Wind today? Today, this place is a symbolic place that belongs to the people of San Sebastian and to the visitors. It is a place for silent meditation. It is a meeting point. It is really a place for encounter with the unknown. It is a place for the observation of the sea, the waves, the sky, and the mountains. And in the stormy days with high tide, the waves take all the space with an incredible energy. The Comb of the Wind seemed like walls that could protect the city from the storm. Chillida has really created a sacred space, a free space where deity can appear in a certain moment. It has something to do with Heidegger also. It is a space where we can transit, we can live and experience a fusion between spirituality and materiality. And I'd like to finish this presentation because it's also an invitation to come to San Sebastian and experience the Comb of the Wind. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nausica, very, very much for that. I'm sure we'll all be on our way to San Sebastian very, very shortly. It was a marvelous exposition of something that I have seen 2 or 3 times and now understand very, very much better. But while you were talking, I was thinking that maybe the simple lesson for all of us is that sculpture and buildings don't mix, that this is a question really that I had for all 3 of you. One of them always has to come first, and the one that comes first always wins the battle. Chillida was working with an architect who was in a way supporting him, whereas Nevelson and Koenig and the other artists at the World Trade Center were in a sense already in competition with the space that they had been given. I don't know whether any of you, Nicholas, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's true. I think they thought they were working together very well, but I think the reality is that the towers and that vast plaza were so dominant that it was not possible for the art to assert itself in a way. Interestingly, the James Rosati piece at the back, which moved, became very, very popular among the Studio 54 crowd for promoting new fashions. It was that sort of had its own life, but it's the one that's least that actually stands more apart from the towers and the galleries than anything else. The great irony of this space, and I didn't point it out because it's almost too terrible to point out, is how respectful Yamasaki was of the Islamic tradition.
That is
it's a very powerful part of the memory that we've lost, I think. I do think of one case where the collaboration is wonderful, and that is in Mexico between what's his name, between Matiscuritz and the architect.
Barragan.
Yeah, Barragan. That's a fantastic collaboration.
Your comment, Neil, reminds me of an episode with Dubuffet, the French artist who did lots of public sculpture, often in plazas in American cities, and he was given a prize by the American Institute of Architects for his contribution to architecture. And when he accepted the prize, he said, well, you haven't understood. You thought that my work complemented the architecture, but the whole point of my work was to draw attention to all the things that were missing from your architecture.
Nausica, is there not a story about Chillida commissioned to do a public sculpture in England, which was then changed in the process of construction?
In England?
And he then refused the installation.
Yes, we have a sculpture here in the museum that was a command for England, and finally it was, I don't remember, I think it's Southampton. It's a city in the south of England, and finally he rejected the idea. And well, but I was thinking again about the relationship with the architect and with Peña Ganchegui. And what is interesting is that they were really thinking about the philosophy of the city, and they wanted really to think the space. And for example, later than the Come of the Wind, they realized they did another work together in Gasteiz, in Vitoria. It's another city. It's the capital of the Basque Country, and they did a square with a sculpture of Chillida, and the square was designed also by Peña Ganchegui, and it's a place it's a sort of homage to the Basque old laws, and it's a place for encounter also, but it's a place for traditional sports, Basque sports. And it's very interesting because it's in the center of the city. And what is really interesting is that they were thinking about how a city has to be. And it has to be a place where everyone, the architects, the philosophers, the writers, and everyone has to say something about it and to construct something, not separately, but in common for the community.
I'm conscious a little bit that time is running, and I did want to ask one question from the audience, partly because I selfishly wanted to know what you had to say, which is, in a way, what are the lessons for all of us in terms of the commissioning of public art today, and the process, the questions about ownership and representation that all of your presentations have raised? I mean, Nicholas or Adrian, do you want to say something?
I would say one thing, and that is that the burden you place on the artist by asking one object to charge a space is too high. And that is an issue. And it's worked sometimes, but I think that's a real problem. If you've got series of massive architectural structures and an empty space between, and you say to an artist, do something to charge, to invest this space with meaning and electricity and dynamism, it's too large a commission, intellectual commission, to ask for.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you all very, very much. I'm much wiser as a result of listening to you all for an hour. So particularly thank you to Nausica and Adrian and Nicholas, but also to Hauser Wirth for making this event this evening possible. I very much hope that some kind of edited version will be available on the Hauser Wirth website. But that has really been enormously informative. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you all. It was fun.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it as well.